Good evening. It's a great honor and an even greater pleasure to interview Arno Motulsky about his life in genetics and the founding of medical genetics here at the University of Washington. Arno, will you start by telling us about being a boy in Fischhausen and the story of how that boy became this man?
Of course. Well, I was born many years ago in a little town in what was then Germany, which now is part of Russia, and the northern part of what was called East Prussia. My parents had a small all-around store there, which had come to my father from his father, and I started going to a regular school when I was 6, 7 years old, and the school system was there. If you went further than the 5th grade, you went to a more fancy high school. So my parents sent me to Königsberg, which was a town, now Kaliningrad, 35 kilometers from Fischhausen, where we lived. And that was a classic gymnasium. So there, that meant in the 5th grade, they taught Latin. The next grade, you added French. In the 2 grades later, you had Greek, plus the other usual languages and things like that. I started the school there in 1933. As you may recall, the Nazis, Hitler started his government in 1933, in January 1933. And there were no, as you know, I'm Jewish, and there were no restrictions at that particular time. But over the years, the kids in class there were 4 or 5 other Jewish kids in that class, and they didn't deal with us and didn't talk to us at all.
What instigated that? What instigated the ostracism?
I guess the general feeling in the country and the
so this was
radio
social,
and
not
so
legal at that point.
Yeah, and many of them they belonged to the Hitler youth of those ages. So there were occasionally fight, but nothing serious. It's interesting at that time, I mentioned that to you, that in Germany you had to take courses in religion. Regardless, they gave it to the religion you wanted. And there was the rabbi of the town came and gave Jewish religion lessons when the other kids had either Catholic or usually Protestant meetings, lessons. So I stayed in that school and went to school there in that area of Germany. My father, for a variety of reasons, had been in trouble with the Nazis, and he left early. Early with the idea of coming to America later. He had a brother who had moved here to Chicago just in 1934, 1 year after Hitler came. In the meantime, we were in this East Prussian place, and things got worse, and he finally then left Germany completely, and he meant to go to Chicago, but as you recall, the way you got to this country, you needed a quota number, and the quota was for Germans was pretty good.
And this was a number given by the U.S. government.
That's the U.S.
for immigration purposes.
For immigration purposes, and this was based on the number of immigrants many years before, at a time where they mostly English and things like that, and Scandinavian, but not Italian and Jews and Russians and things like that. Now, fortunately, having been born in Germany, the quota number was fairly good, but not very good. You still had to wait several years, several at that time and thereafter. But my father then went to Cuba, figuring he'd wait there to come to America till his quota number came up. In the meantime, things in Germany got much worse, and he became anxious that we might get into trouble, so he decided to help us out to go to meet him in Cuba, and then we all would go to Chicago from there. So that was done by the appropriate paperwork, and the paperwork at that time was not that easy, but it was possible to get entry permits into Cuba. However, at that, we then got a boat, and you may have heard about that, the St. Louis. The St. Louis was a big, very fancy Hamburg-American boat, and we went in Hamburg in April 1939 on this boat with another 950, 60 refugees. The boat left, and they treated us quite nicely. It was fancy, nice to be on a boat like that.
So this was out of Hamburg,
out
headed
of Hamburg
for Havana.
To Havana. And things were fine the first part of the trip, and even later on. And then when we landed in Havana Harbor one early morning, we thought we'd disembark shortly thereafter, and they told us there's some problem and so on, it has to be delayed for a little while. So we didn't get off, we weren't allowed to get off the boat. In the meantime, we tried to find out what went on in Havana, and fortunately I'd studied some Spanish, and I knew how to translate from the Spanish newspaper to the people waiting, knowing what's going to happen to them. So there was another guy, in fact, who later on became a professor of biochemistry in Holland, whom I met later on somehow, and he did the translations.
How old were you at this time?
I was 16, 15.
15, 16?
Yeah. And he was a year or two older, anyway. So the second day went by, the third day went by, and nothing happened. They wouldn't let us off, and telegrams were sent all over the place to America. The point was made to America that we all had these visas, thing that would come through half a year later, and so they would to let us in a little earlier, but nothing. So the boat finally was asked to leave Havana Harbor, and went into the Caribbean area looking someplace else, but initially, in fact, it went and stopped, sort of went around Miami. We should see Miami, and the planes from Coast Guard came, and the boats from that came, and they shushed us off. And
so no one was giving permission for the boat to land?
No one was. One guy early in the harbor tried to commit suicide. He made it through, and he didn't have to leave. Anyway, after all this happening, the boat finally left direction Europe, Germany. I mean, it was a German boat and would have gone back there. Something had happened that I found out just recently, which I didn't know before. It went to the Canadian border near Halifax.
So your ship went all the way up the coast, from Miami all the way up to Nova Scotia.
And not apparently, the Canadian government also refused entry of these people. So it went now direction Germany. There were many people who had been in concentration camps and things like that. There were younger men who were going to have a mutiny, but fortunately they prevented that. They had a local committee of people who talked to them that they get everyone into trouble.
Tell us about the captain. It's very interesting about the captain of the ship.
The captain was a German who was very decent, who had told his people that they should treat us properly and so on, and practically all of them did. It was okay. The food wasn't so good anymore.
Not after all those months.
After this nice ship that had all kinds of stuff, but still, they got something.
Tell us about the captain's plans with the ship, if you will.
Well, the plan, the captain that we knew he was good. We found out later, And the committee of the people who were representing us had found out, he had told them, that if we would have to go back to Germany, what he would do is he would run the ship aground on the British coast, and then they had to evacuate the people, and we would be saved that way. So fortunately, a few days out of Europe, after writing all these telegrams and the world hearing about it and on their newsreels and papers and this and that, France, England, Holland, and Belgium, 4 countries, decided to take 1/4 of the passengers each. And by the luck of the draw, we, my mother, brother, and sister, and I, ended up in Belgium. And so they took us off to Brussels.
Where did the ship actually dock then?
Antwerp.
In Antwerp?
For everyone, for all the people. So we just took the train they took us to Antwerp, and the other ones went on boats to Holland.
And the Nazis have not come into Belgium yet?
No, this is still before the Germans had started. So we lived in Brussels. At that time, I had to go to a high school now, and this was a French-speaking high school. And in Belgium, you also had to have lessons or take courses in Flemish, the other language, which is almost like Dutch. So I learned to read Flemish and Dutch.
So by now you have Greek, you have German, Greek, Latin, little Hebrew that you left out, Spanish, French, Flemish.
Yes.
Adding up.
Yeah, I still can read French pretty good.
Very well, very well.
So where were we?
You were in high school. You were in high school in Belgium, trying to speak Flemish.
So I'm in high school, and so that was pretty good. And then quite a few months went by, and in the meantime, we hoped that our American visas would come through. So on the 1st of May, the following year, we were asked to come to Antwerp American Consulate to pick up our visas. We did, went back to Brussels, and thought and had our visas and hoped somehow to get out, which was a little harder before the war. Well, on the 10th of May, 10 days after we had the visa, one morning I woke up at 6 in the morning and I heard lots of thunder, but it was the German bombers coming by, attacking Brussels, attacking Belgium. So I had read the papers, and I told my mother, they said, we have to pack our things. We won't be able to see it. They're going to take us away. Well, later in the morning, the police came and said everyone has to come to the police station. And at the police station, there were all the Germans, the regular Germans who might be Nazis and who weren't Jewish or so on, and the Jewish people like us. And at the end of the day, they decided that women and children could leave. And I thought I was a child, I was a little, 16, and so on. I went with the children, and the policeman said, "How old are you?" And I told him, and he said, "You stay here." So I then stayed with this group of people, and the Germans, they were making progress, and they were worried now in Belgium that the Germans would come over. So on the second day after this, they put us to evacuate us to the countryside from Brussels.
And they were doing this because you were German.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, we were enemy aliens.
Right, you were German enemy aliens in Belgium from their point of view.
Right. And so that ultimately, after a few days, took us now through the French border into France. And in France, they took us to a camp that had been used for Spanish Republicans who had fled to France for the war, but in Franco War and things like that. And they in fact, it's interesting. The captain in charge of this French captain, he was a Jewish guy, and he spoke German fluently. He came from the Alsace, where many, black people, and he treated us quite well.
This was Saint-Cyprien?
No, this is Le Vigeon, was the name of the place. And so they, after, I don't know, was a week or something like that, was very difficult, not much to eat and so on, but it was all right. So they took us out of there with a camp again on horrible trains, and not regular trains that were made for horses and people. It said 10 horses or 40 people on each train. And so we went to the next camp, which was a big camp on the Mediterranean, Saint-Cyprien, which is near the city of Perpignan, right in the south of France. And this is beautiful, right on the Pyrenees. This is summer, the weather is good. We could go swimming in the Mediterranean, except there wasn't much to eat, because the whole transportation of food and so on didn't work very well in France. And but what we could get is peaches, because they couldn't sell them or send them around. So we ate a lot of peaches there. And so the food was very poor. Everything was difficult in the sense typhoid fever broke out, diarrhea, and people died, and so on. We lived in huts. And I showed you a picture. For some reason, someone took a picture of our hut, and somehow I saved that around.
And you all look, at that time, you're very thin, but you look well.
Right. I should have brought the picture.
We'll put it into the archives.
Right.
And am I correct that you were not actively mistreated at the camp?
No. These were all the French.
They were still thinking of you as a German alien.
Yes.
And that's why you were in the camp.
And the Germans won the war quite rapidly in June that year. And then the German Gestapo, the police came, the secret police, to check everyone. And they sent the regular Germans home. And us, the Jews and refugees and political people, stayed in that camp. And
this was part of Vichy France.
This is now Vichy France. And the situation got worse and so on. It was very bad living there with all these problems and people being sick and so on. And then one day they had floods, tremendous floods. They had to take us out and take us someplace else. They took us out of this place and sent us to another camp, which had been one of the worst camps of this sort in France, Gurs. And it was raining there and muddy, and you couldn't walk around, and it was horrible food and so on.
That was up in the mountains?
That's not in the mountains, but,
Inland north.
Yeah. And so we stayed there, and now, in fact, I could exchange letters with my father, who in the meantime had gotten to America. However, something good happened in the sense that I and not many other people were able to show the French administration there that you had a chance to leave the country. And they didn't want all these people in the camps, so they allowed those of us who were had to leave. And because I had this visa to come to America, which had run out, it was good for 4 months only, to go to another camp in Les Milles, which was not very far from Marseille. And in fact, Feuchtwanger, a German writer, he was interned there, and he wrote a book about his experience in Les Milles. So
did you do you know if you ever met him?
Did I? No. No. Didn't. So from that camp, then also you can go to Marseille, and there was a man by the name of Fry, an American, who had been gotten by a certain American organization to get out of the Vichy France, who got into all kinds of difficulties, people who were writers and actors and important professors and so on to get him out.
To try to help rescue
so he
Jewish intellectuals.
Yes, political and Jewish people and so on. He got him, quite a few of them, out, and he in the book he wrote an autobiography, and you can read all about him. And in fact, some of the people with me, they took me to meet him, but I'm just a boy.
You're a kid.
He had plenty more important things to get out, but he said hello to me.
This was the fall of 1940? Summer of 1940.
Yeah. So, but the point was now to leave there and get to America. So one had to go to the American consulate in Marseille. And the American consulate was just hundreds and hundreds of people. People tried to get out, to America, and the personnel, the American young boys, they were in their 20s or something like that, didn't treat us very well. And however, since this visa was, I had one, they renewed it. And I now had an American visa. With it, I could go to America, or somewhere I could go to America, but that was very, very difficult. And so I went around the travel bureaus in Marseille.
So you could come and go from this camp?
Yeah, you walked a long time, then you took a bus, but then you were in Marseille. So that made you could go to these places. So I did that, and ultimately they gave me a renewal of the visa, but then it meant to find out some ship or something to go to. I found out from that bureau there was a ship from Lisbon, a Portuguese ship, neutral, they weren't in the war, and that I could go there. But then it also meant I had to have an exit visa from France. Well, they want to get rid of me anyway. That was easy.
That was easy, right.
But then I had to have a transit visa to Spain to go to Portugal.
And Spain were allies of the Germans.
And they were allied with Franco and the Germans and so on. And they had a rule that if you were a man between 18 and 40, they wouldn't let you transit because they were worried you might join the British Army or things like that. Well, 3 weeks before my 18th birthday, I transited Spain, and I was I'm very unhappy when they came through and checked the papers, but they thought I was not 18. And they let me
It's so
through.
interesting how they follow these legalistic niceties in the midst of this.
Well, they might not have. That's what
they might not have. They might not have.
Anyway.
So you got across Spain?
I got to Spain. I got on the boat, and the boat was stopped near Bermuda by the British. To make sure that this was all right. And that they kept us for a day, and then we went on. And I ended up in New York and took the bus to Chicago and met my dad, who I hadn't seen for years.
Wow.
Yes.
Meanwhile, what had happened to your mother and sisters and brothers?
Well, that's a separate story.
Can you tell a short version?
Well, yes. My mother, brother, and sister, when the Germans attacked Belgium, they fled like many of the other people in Belgium in the direction France. And they got into France, but the Germans were faster, and the German army overtook them and sent them back to Brussels, where they were. And so they were now in Brussels under German occupation. They left them alone for a while, but then they didn't have much money or anything. So one thing, the people who left Germany in those days, they were allowed to take articles like household articles and clothes and things like that.
Dishes and clothes and furniture.
Yeah, but not too much. And they had them in what they called lifts. And this lift was left in the Hamburg harbor on the idea we were in Hamburg and had left from there, be ultimately shipped to America.
In principle.
And but now they were able to ship it from Hamburg to Antwerp and get the stuff in Brussels. and she sold some of that stuff and made and lived. So then, some months later or so, they got the order, it was a year later, to report for resettlement to the east. At that time, it didn't meant to be killed yet, but we knew that's what happened to these people. They knew that was not so good, and they were able, with help, we had a professor of pathology who was married to a German woman who was a friend of my mother's, and somehow he had connections, and he gave them false papers, and they took the train through occupied France to a little town in Switzerland, in France, on the Swiss border, and one night they went over the border and were not caught. If they would have been caught, the Swiss sent back people where they came from, Nazi France in this case. So, but they were now in Switzerland, and in fact, the next day they went to the railroad station, said, "You want to go to Zurich?" And a policeman came and said, "What are you doing here? Who are you?" My mother pulled out her American visa, says, "I'm going to the American consulate in Zurich, and we are going to America." So that's what ultimately happened. You come
by your chutzpah, honestly, yeah.
that happened ultimately later, because the war didn't end till mid-45, and then in early 46 was able to get them all back to Chicago.
So when you arrived in Chicago, were you and your dad aware that they were safe in Switzerland?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
That took quite a while. In fact, we didn't know. We knew they were in Brussels, you know, at that time. And we got a telegram, safe in Switzerland. So that was, now this story is a long story, but it's true, but it's really fantastic if you tell it now, all these things that happened. And we had to have a fantastic amount of luck. I mean, that many people, unfortunately, paid their lives for all this. And
I would say you have paid back for your luck.
Well.
So you're in Chicago.
Yes.
You're 18 years old.
Yes.
English is now your 9th language. And, and you decided to go to school.
So I had to go to school. Now, I'd missed high school the last, you know, because of the camps and, you know, all that stuff.
Although you told me that in the camps, some of the people were teachers and they taught biochemistry and physics.
Well, they didn't teach biochemistry, but they taught, these were professors of physics at the university.
Right. Okay.
The level of their courses was pretty high. But there were lower courses too, in languages and other things.
So you went to school in Chicago, and how did you manage it? You hadn't had high school.
Yeah, but I could take an examination where you took certain things, including they let me take an exam in German. So,
very nice.
No,
very
not
nice.
in German.
An examination of German.
Of German for an American or an American person.
That might be a little shady. Did pretty well on that one, I'll bet.
That was all right. Anyway, I passed these exams and was able to go to college now. Now, again, my dad also we didn't have any money really to go to usual college. In fact, I lived not far from the University of Chicago. And there was one school where you could go take courses in the evening and Saturday. And it was called the Central YMCA College, which later on became Roosevelt University. So I signed up there, and I went and took my various usual pre-medical courses, actually, because I had wanted, at that time, I had wanted to become a psychiatrist, a physician. So.
And what was your day job? What did you do during the day?
During the day, my relatives in Chicago, he was a physician. He had some connection with the hospital you were born in.
The hospital I was born in.
Michael Reese Hospital.
This was before that. Not by much, but it was.
And I got a job in a virology lab, animal lab, taking care of monkeys and mice and things like that.
So you have an appreciation of
pretty dirty job.
Yeah.
But the guy in charge, he was a PhD virologist, and he tried to teach me how to do experiments and controls and things. That was not.
Yeah.
I learned something.
And was it at the Y college that you met Gretel?
Yes, and Gretel, when my wife, she was there, and I met her, and she had invited me to some party where a friend of hers was there, and she wanted to put me up with that girl, but in fact, anyway.
You made a better choice. You definitely made the right choice.
I ultimately, married her. So that now I am in Chicago, and I want to go to medical school, and I take many of the courses, but I hadn't all of them. So I applied to medical school. The University of Illinois in Chicago had a very good medical school. In fact, who were specializing sort of in neurology and psychiatry and neurosurgery, and I liked that because I thought I was going in that direction. And so I had to go for interviews and so on, and they accepted me. But that will be the following year. In the meantime, also, the draft had started in this country, and I signed up for the draft, and they shortly thereafter took me in. But they said, since I am a medical student who's been accepted to the medical school, they will assign me to what was called the Army Specialized Training Program, which existed during the war, particularly for medicine and dentistry and areas that were necessary for the war effort. They had quite a big program, too, for liberal sciences, for people to become officers and so on. And Kissinger, he was on that, but that program was canned completely because they felt they needed people to go with soldiers and not that. But the medical school one, that's the one that
was retained.
So I stayed in the medical school, didn't have vacation, so I stayed in medical school from 44.
But where did they send you for the special training before you went to Illinois medical school?
Yes, it was something very important.
It was very nice. Right?
Yes, very nice. They didn't. I hadn't finished all my courses in order to be accepted in medical school. I had to finish it, and the Army Specialized Training Program had places all over the country. And I think by the luck of the draw, mostly again, they told me, you go to Yale University to finish up your pre-med. Now, after the camps in Vichy, France, and all those things and the things that happened, the contrast was considerable to live.
You told me that you walked into the main library at Yale and you looked up at the vaulted ceiling and you said, I think I've died and gone to heaven.
Yes.
So how long were you at Yale?
Well, at Yale, I for about not quite a year, 3 quarters.
Right.
And then before going to back to medical school in Chicago, I became an orderly in Army hospital, not far from there. And it was nice. I felt that to become a doctor rather than do what an orderly in a hospital does. But
But probably gave you a very good appreciation.
Yes, exactly. So
then they sent you back for the 1944.
For beginning of medical school. The medical school was the usual kind of course. The genetics didn't exist in those days, but there people. They had very interesting people. They had a professor of anatomy. But he didn't like to talk about anatomy. He liked to talk about philosophy and things like that. And that was very good.
So you and he got along very well.
was very good. And there were some pretty good people. Also, one other interesting thing with this neurology, they had the world expert in electroencephalography at the time.
Really?
And they also had a very good PhD neurophysiologist. but I didn't know much about the EEG, but I knew neurophysiology. This guy seemed to be a famous guy. I went to his lab and said I'd like to work in the summer. This was the last summer where they had a summer still in medical school. And he quizzed me, and he found I didn't have enough math to work in his lab. So he gets, go to this electroencephalography guy, and so they took me, and they taught me how to put on the electrodes, and then the next day they taught me how to read the patterns of it, and after 1 week they said, you are in, you can take care of everything now, and we'll come once a week and we'll check up on your readings, which were done to the veterans' hospitals and things like that. Well, I did well most of the time.
The patients are
so, but then I figured, that field, I'm not going to go there. If a medical student can be taught in less than 2 weeks.
You told me that your first genetics class was when you were at Yale. You didn't have it in Illinois, but that you had
yes,
genetics.
No, I guess we went through Yale already. Yes, when I was at Yale, one of the courses that I could take was a regular genetics course by a Drosophila geneticist who was quite well known. His name is Poulsen. And so I liked Drosophila genetics.
Absolutely.
Most people didn't even like that, and I liked.
They didn't know.
And I liked genetics, and later on in medical school there were some of those diseases, but no real teaching anyway. So where are we now?
You were graduating from medical school in 1947.
Right.
Right. And back you come to Michael Reese Hospital for your internship.
Yes. So I took in those days, which still, no, you can't do it anymore. You had the choice between internship is a rotating one, where you go to different specialties, or one in internal medicine or surgery or obstetrics, gynecology, and things like that. I took a rotating internship, and that really was quite good. In fact, the other guy with me, I didn't tell you that, was a guy who had sort of the inclinations that I had, and we liked it. We didn't care for the various things we had to do, and we talked about philosophy and interesting books we read and papers. So that was very good. Now he, in the meantime, became a famous psychiatrist first, and professor at Stanford and all over, and he's retired now.
What's his name?
Hamburg, David Hamburg.
This is David Hamburg?
Yes, he's quite well known.
The father of our FDA?
And his daughter is the chief of the director of the FDA now, which is interesting, Margaret.
Right.
In fact, I found a picture of her a few weeks ago, in old pictures, where she had a brother, and she and her brother and her parents came to see us in Seattle one day, and we took pictures of them, and here's our agent.
I didn't realize that. So you and David were residents together?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, interns.
Interns together.
And he later on went to psychiatry.
Psychiatry, right.
Yeah.
But back to you. So here you are. You're enjoying internship and the rotating part of it. And
yes.
Was it at that point that you fell in with Dr. Singer?
Yes. In other words, I was going to take an internal medicine residency because some of it they didn't work out for neurology or the psych. I didn't. At that time, psychiatry seemed too soft for me. That not the kind of psychiatry done at that particular time. So.
How did you meet Dr. Singer?
Dr. Singer, he was the head of hematology at Michael Reese Hospital, and he was a hematologist who, unlike most hematologists in those days who were very structurally minded, and he was biochemically and genetically minded.
So he was more interested in the analysis rather than the description.
He knew what was in the air in terms of research. There's one bit of research that was very interesting, that he assigned me shortly after I came there as a fellow, that he had read a paper that you should take hemoglobin from fetal cells, fetal hemoglobin from newborns, or things like that, and compared it with normal hemoglobin, that's adult hemoglobin, there are differences in terms of antibody development. So I should do the same thing to try that if I take hemoglobin from sickle cell versus hemoglobin from normal, then I might be able to show that. Well, the rabbits that I used to make the antibodies aren't good antibody formers, and hemoglobin isn't a very good antigen really. Anyway, I worked at this for a number of months and nothing happened, and I just gave it up. If you would have found it, 4 months after this, a paper came out from Pauling, sickle cell anemia, a molecular disease, where they showed electrophoretic differences. And this was the first disease that clearly was shown to be molecular difference.
So the development of electrophoresis was of enormous importance.
Well, that was electrophoresis. Now, let's see with that. No, I'm going back in the Army.
You are going to go back in the Army, imminently. So you worked with Dr. Singer for a while, then you completed your medical residency.
Right.
And then
the Army had sent me to medical school.
Right.
And so on. They said, you come and join us now as a physician.
Had the Korean War started yet?
The Korean War had just started, too. Yes. So they took me, and I had to do a few of the things, the crazy things where you have to crawl and they send bullets over you. And
you left that part out when you were telling me before.
and things like that. But you know, that.
Both you and the Army survived the experience. And I understand that they sent you then to Walter Reed.
Yes. Well, first of all, I was very lucky. They assigned me to a regular internal medicine hospital where they had interesting special cases. And 2-3 days after
was that in Indiana?
This was in Indiana.
Oh, Indiana.
3 days after I was there, a man in his 20s came in, that he had a spot on his lungs and tuberculosis. And I, as the doctor who was trained to do a full physical examination, I went to him and looked at him carefully, and I saw he had a lot of red spots on his lips, on his tongue, like that, and I knew from my training that there is a disease that's called Hemorrhagic Telangiectasia, and the people have nosebleeds too, that they get arteriovenous fistulas, that they form to the vessel, the artery, and the vein together in their lung, and if you put the stethoscope to that area, which I did, you hear, you can say. So I went to my boss, and I said, this guy has hemorrhagic telangiectasia. He said, what are you talking about?
There's TB, right?
So they operated him, he had it, and so on. So my reputation in that hospital was made.
It was made, and you saved the young man's life. Right.
So I stayed there for about 8-9 months, but then I was again lucky. I was lucky in everything.
You make a lot of your own luck.
The Army had started a new research unit in hematology at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, their main hospital, and the Army somehow found this guy Colonel Crosby, who was an Army hematologist, terrific guy, very very academically minded, and so he went, worked that out. And
got you transferred to him?
It got me transferred to Washington, D.C., and working at the hospital on various things, and he let me do whatever I wanted to in terms of research. So
what did you do?
Well, one thing, in the lab next to me, again I was very lucky, there was a man who had fabricated electrophoretic machine out of plastic, and was able to do, in those days they only ran proteins, And I figured proteins, Pauling just showed you can do this with electrophoresis. Well, let me make such a machine with you, or so on. We did, and I was able then to do paper electrophoresis on the hemoglobin, show heterozygotes, compound
So you were able to separate C and S?
C and S, and everything worked very well. So that worked very well. And I worked on some immunologic things, of trying to make antibodies, a variety of things, and it worked very fine. Now I didn't have the lead. The army wanted me there to stay there, because they had sent me to Puerto Rico, and they had sprue disease and things like that, and they thought I should spend time in Puerto Rico, but they said no, I want to leave the army. So I left the army, and I needed...
That was with the end of the Korean War?
No, the Korean War was still going on.
It was.
Yeah. So I left it, and then I was looking for a job, and fortunately Seattle here was a new medical school, and Clement Finch, he was the head in hematology, he was a terrific scientist too. He was looking for a young person who had some background. I had background with all that,
for sure.
And he talked to me, and he says, I give you a job in Seattle, instructor. So that was pretty good. I said, I'm not a fellow, I'm an instructor. That was better.
Good for you. So he came to Washington to look for people?
Well, no. He had heard about me, that I was a hematologist in the army who had the training that he wanted for his fellows, postdocs. So now I'm at the University of Washington.
And what did Gretel say when you proposed to her that you
Oh
both
my God, we're going to Alaska.
Not too far off. She adapted very quickly.
Yes.
Right. So here you are in Seattle, 1953.
Yes. And here I've been ever since.
Right, indeed. Right. So when you first came here, Dr. Williams was chair of medicine.
That's right.
And what were you teaching and what were you doing?
Well, I wasn't teaching very much. Some lectures in hematology I gave, but I felt there was no genetics whatsoever, like in most medical schools, and I already felt with my interest and background that the medical students should get some knowledge about genetics. So what I did is I made sort of a bootleg series of lectures where I used clinical examples, trying to pick them to be from hematology. There were not even genetic things in hematology, which were worked out quite good. Although I remember one student, I was explaining something, and he pulled out his handkerchief and waved his white.
We will have to put the students up to this.
He became later on an important administrator in the medical.
In our medical school. Do we dare ask
he
who
was
this
very
was?
good. He's retired a long time.
So after you were giving the lectures in genetics, did you discuss this with Dr. Finch or with Dr. Williams?
Yes, well, I discussed it. No, they couldn't help me. They were hematology, he was in hematology, Finch, and Williams was in internal medicine. I tried the committee, the curriculum committee, and they thought, no, we don't need this.
Who needs
some
this
old-fashioned,
stuff?
new-fashioned stuff.
Right.
Anyway, so it took quite a while before they allowed a course, a obligatory course of genetics. But in the meantime, we were able to get work done in a whole variety of things. We had the hematology, in hematology, the sickle cell, the abnormal hemoglobins of various sorts. The other thing I got interested in then and did research on is G6pd deficiency. Here, this was again a condition that clearly is genetic, and that would produce, well, first of all, it might protect you against malaria, and I did work on that, because that hadn't been shown. So what I did is I got into touch with a guy in Africa who'd published about sickling and other things, and with people in Sardinia that had a high
rate of
malaria, to do work there on G6pd deficiency.
Was that Siniscalco?
Siniscalco. So I went I took off for 3-4 months, and I went to Africa, to the then Belgian Congo, and I got into touch with a guy there, and we went in the bush and found, not only in the bush, but also we went to, they had lots of Catholic schools, and the Belgian doctor said it's necessary that they have their blood taken. In those days we didn't have informed consent. We just went there and took their.
And of course you have both your Belgian French and your Flemish immediately to hand, right?
The African kids didn't speak Flemish.
But the doctors did.
But interesting, the university in Leopoldville, they had both Flemish and French-speaking people, and once they invited me to a party there, and they all stuck to each other. They didn't stick to, the French faculty was French and the other. And in fact, the courses had to be given for the poor African students.
Oh.
They had to learn Flemish because it was a Belgian school.
The African students were multilingual in order to manage this. Right. And who sponsored this work in Sardinia and Congo?
The Rockefeller Foundation. Yeah, I went to them and explained to them these various things. They're very nice.
You told me that the Rockefeller Foundation, after the Korean War, really sought out young investigators that they thought could take advantage of the opportunities now to travel in a relatively peaceful world.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that was. I just outlined. Like I'm telling you a little more, they're smart people who are giving the grants, and they said, okay, this makes sense, and they let me go.
Right. So did you think of yourself already as a human geneticist at that time?
No. That came a little later. Still here in Seattle, about that time. Dr. Williams had I participated in grand rounds, and I talked up genetics in there and things like that. And he also felt I liked to do independent work, and he felt Finch, wanted more to use me, which he did for some of his iron work. So he came to me one day, and he said, I thought about you, and I thought about genetics, your interest in genetics. I'd like you to set up a unit, a division of medical genetics in the Department of Medicine, like hematology or cardiology or gastroenterology. No, there was hardly anything like that. There were no role models of that sort. And I thought, well, I'm pretty much on the way to be a hematologist, and I'm not so sure about it. But I tell you what, I haven't thought about it completely carefully. I need to go to both Europe and in this country, all the departments, division, units that are called human genetics, and I'll see what they are doing and whether that fits with what I like to know. And I went there and found that it was pretty old-fashioned according to my ideas, some of the modern kind of stuff that could be done. And I came back and said, okay, I'll be happy to set up such a unit.
You told me that there was one place in America that was particularly fine.
Yes, I was looking sort of for a role model. I was just a young kid. Well, not so
You're not a kid anymore. Yeah.
No, but not that.
You can't lay that on me.
No, not that old.
You must have been at least 25 by this point.
No, yes. I was around 30. Yeah.
So where did you go that you thought was particularly fine as a role model?
Well, James Neal, who died some 5 years ago, was a Drosophila geneticist earlier, and then he went to medical school, and he became the most outstanding sort of human medical geneticist in terms of human studies and population studies and hemoglobin studies. He did, and sort of some of the things I'd learned and talked to you about already and so on. He liked that because he was thinking better or more than I did. So I thought he would be a very good role model, and that was the only one. So what we did here is what we did. One other thing I'd like to do, and that worked to some extent, is that really to do complete EAT, human and medical genetics, you need many subfields. You need cytogenetics and immunogenetics and statistical genetics, particularly, and things like that, that ultimately a real hot unit would have sub-people in that. Now, talking about that, the first sub-people who came, who was of that sort, is Stan Gartler. Because he had been fully trained as a geneticist, a PhD geneticist, and he got sideswiped into psychiatric genetics, which didn't work very well. But then he got interested also in biochemical genetics in New York, and so his background seemed good. So we flew him here in the winter. It was horrible plane rides. And now I once went to with you and Marion on these rides, and I figured he might not come to this new school.
I think Stan was very used to bumpy planes. He'd been in a few during the war himself.
Yeah. Right. So he did accept, and we didn't have money, but the pediatrics department gave us some money and so on, and so he became a first anchorman who was a real geneticist. I always felt, particularly, the real department of genetics still didn't exist at that time. That came 2 or 3 years later. And Herschel Roman was
and the
there.
time we're talking about now is 56, 57?
Yeah. Herschel Roman was chairman there, and he hadn't done any human medical genetics, but he sort of was interested in what we were doing and tried to help us in different ways. So Stan mainly was the liaison between medical genetics and real genetics.
He still is.
Some of the people I felt, they thought I'm just another doctor, and my God, so I felt that they looked down on me a little bit.
Did you think so?
Yes. But they didn't. I felt they didn't fully, and I think that's true to some extent.
People who looked down on genetics probably quietly realized their error after a while. They may never have admitted it. You told me that it was about this time that you met Harry Harris also.
Yes. Well, I felt, because you heard about my background. My background in statistics wasn't that great, and I felt that there was a lot of statistics in genetics still, and still is, and so on, that I looked around, and I had looked around before, where one might get good training in modern genetics that was considered good. And so I looked around, and I found that Penrose in London, that was the best unit. And so I arranged to go there, and you asked about
Harry.
About Harry Harris. Now Harry Harris was a very excellent biochemical type of geneticist, and has written very good things and has done modern things and so on. So
was he with Penrose at that time?
He was. Well, he was at Penrose. But just about the time I came, he got another job in one of the other hospitals, and I saw he came over occasionally, and I got a chance to talk to him. But he had left. The one who still was there at the Gorton laboratory, it wasn't called Gorton for him, was Haldane.
Of
You know,
course,
he had
Haldane
been
was
at
the
that
Bolton
part.
then, yes.
And he was quite an interesting guy. I overlapped with him over 2-3 months, and but we often had teas and coffee, teas, not coffees, teas, and so on. And he came and he made wild statements, but he was fantastically brilliant. And I got to read his little books of various sorts. So, but he left and went to India.
He went to India
at that time.
Did you discuss with him evolution, population genetics?
With Haldane, I didn't really talk much to him. I just was, another fellow, and just come there. So I didn't. Penrose, you didn't. When you saw him, when you want to show him something, sometimes you might have written something and some data. He didn't want to see what you've written. He wanted to see the data, and.
You've been like that ever since. You learned that from him. Or maybe you already knew it, but you're absolutely that way. You don't want the summary, you want the actual data. Now it's a lot of data.
Right.
You told me that it was also that it was only shortly thereafter that Joe Felsenstein came to the department.
Yes, Joe, Joe, when did you come?
It's almost 10 years later.
10 years later, okay.
It was 10 years.
We should put that off for a while. Okay. Right. When I had asked Arno today.
And he helped me grow very greatly, because at that time, because there was a genetics department, I had to teach a course in human genetics, and I felt it should have a lot of statistics, but I felt I wasn't good enough to teach that. So he taught that very well, and he helped me with various statistical things. Whenever I had a statistical problems, I went to you, and we went to the blackboard, and this was very helpful.
It was at about this time, also in the mid-50s, that the first International Congress of Human Genetics was held in Copenhagen.
Oh, yes.
You said that was a very important meeting from your perspective.
Yes, well, by that time I had done enough genetics of various sorts, so this Congress was the very first one, and I thought it'd be nice to go there. And so at that time, I'd gotten to another area that turned out to be very productive. That one day, I was told by a mouse geneticist in Eugene that they've had some deer mice, not real mice, deer mice, which is
real mice, Permiscus. It's the mouse of all mice.
They were, yeah, but they.
I know, it's not a house mouse.
They were born jaundiced, and he wondered what it was, whether I, as a hematologist, as interested in genetics, I could help him.
Is it natural populations of pyramids?
This is, natural populations. And so I checked them out, and it turned out they had exactly the same phenotype than a human hereditary genetic disease, hereditary spherocytosis, where the cells are round and don't compress it well, and they get caught in the spleen. And in the human, if you take out the spleen, you cure the disease of this. So these mice, they were quite normal, running around and things like that. But if you took their spleen out, it just behaved like it should be, with various other things. So also, so that was very, very helpful. Also, we thought in those days, those were the early days of transplantation, that somehow one could use this phenotype for transplantation. So
isn't there an important segment of this that involves the temperature, the ambient temperature?
No, the ambient temperature, that's an experiment, a crazy experiment I did, but it worked. In human spherocytosis, if you put the cells of that into somewhat higher temperature, they break up.
They lyse.
So blacks had a smaller frequency of spherocytosis, and I thought maybe it's because that in Africa they would be the selection against it. So I just took in vitro the kind of thing and put the cells in regular temperature and the others at a higher temperature in 2 weeks.
From people with spherocytosis?
Not people. These are these deer mice.
From the mice. Okay.
Yeah. And they, the ones who had the higher temperature, they broke up,
Mm-hmm.
they lysed. So
And what about the mice themselves? If the mice were, if the weather became hot, what happened to the mice?
that we didn't have.
You didn't
No,
follow
this
that.
was quite hot. We couldn't
Oh, I
make
see.
them that.
I see.
hot.
I see.
So,
I see. So
and
you-
then we used this as a model for bone for transplantation,
Mm-hmm.
and we're able to change that.
now, how
by-
is it a model for transplantation? What was done?
What was done? They were with radiation shut down their own red cells,
Mhm.
and then give them newborn cells.
And you were able, and you had a marker for measuring the difference.
yeah.
Right. And this was all relevant to the first human genetics meeting.
Oh, yes,
explain
yes,
how.
that's right. I'm sorry.
Right. No, this is all everything's
So I
related.
sent an abstract about my studies of various sorts to Human Genetics meeting in Copenhagen. I never been at such a big meeting of any meeting of this sort. And when I got to there, they said, "We liked your paper. You are going to give it in the plenary session." And I thought that meant pretty a lot, and it did. That I was able to talk, the whole various stories that I had on spherocytosis, and so the
So
meeting
you-
and the meeting was very interesting. Lots of.
You brought a picture.
I brought a picture of the banquet, and on the picture, very prominently, is Stan Gartler and Arno Motulsky, and on the side, Muller, famous geneticist Muller, and the famous statistical geneticist Fisher, and a bunch of other people like that. And between us is a very nice-looking girl. They had too many girls. There are
many-
not enough men.
No,
I mean, there are too many women
Too many
who are
men.
scientists. They had too many men
Right.
and not enough women
Absolutely.
scientists.
Right.
So they assigned their
Definitely.
technicians and secretaries to sit between the men.
Right. And who did a very nice job of it. And you may come up and take a look at it later. Very handsome fellows, our boys. Right. Right.
You didn't recognize Stan when I
I
asked
didn't.
you.
I didn't recognize Stan. It's true. It's true. It's true. But I know Stan now. I didn't know him then. Right. So back you came. It must have been both strange and nice to return to Northern Europe now as an adult, as a professional, as a geneticist with a role in America, and to see Europe again now in a peaceful context.
Yes.
Because Copenhagen's not that far from where you'd lived.
No. Well. Yeah.
Different world, of course. So you said once to me that you think we are defined by our students. And in your case, you had some remarkable students. Could you tell us first a little bit about perhaps your most remarkable student, Joe Goldstein, how he came
Well-
and what you did together?
Well, Joe Goldstein, for those of you who don't know him or about him, was at that time a physician who, in medical school in Texas, was considered the most intelligent, best medical student they ever seen there before. And they offered him a faculty job before he graduated medical school.
Right.
And so after he finished medical school, he looked for a career, what he should do, and he got interested. He was interested then in genetics, and to some extent, no, but less so. So they told him off the various places, and there weren't many places around where you could get this training, he should come here to Seattle. And he came and visited, and I liked it and put him on. I told him a project that I had in my mind for some time is that we knew that increased lipids, cholesterol and so on, that had been pretty well worked out, does produce arteriosclerosis and difficulties with that. So we then did this so-called Seattle myocardial infarct study, where we took 6 hospitals in Seattle and took people who had a heart attack, myocardial infarct, and tested them 3-4 months later to make sure everything equilibrates and so on, and then looked for certain lipids, and clearly shown that the familial hypercholesterolemia, the condition which then, based off this work, Joe Goldstein went on his next fellowship and showed that the abnormality in these familial hypercholesterolemia people was an abnormality in the low density lipoprotein. Right.
You make it sound so straightforward, but it was in fact very complex. You identified the families of all 600 of these.
Yes, yes. No, we did it based on families.
Right. Based on and your staff, you and your staff then interviewed the family members and measured the same.
What we did, and Joe was very good. He might have become a sort of epidemiologist with that.
He kind of did.
You know, with this study, we hired 2 nurses who helped with all this, and with 6 hospitals, and he knew how to learn around, look at, go around and look. So I went around, so that worked out very well.
And so then for each of your index cases, you knew about the index case, and you knew about their brothers and sisters and their children if they had adult children, and you measured the lipid levels and the triglycerides of all of these persons, adjusted for age, adjusted for sex. And then how did you and Joe decide how to take this very large amount of data, family by family, and to extract from that the elements of familial hypercholesterolemia?
Well, we knew what their levels of cholesterol and triglyceride was. And let's say that one group, the one that had the classic familial hypercholesterolemia, they stood clearly out. And it was inherited as an autosomal dominant and so on. So
you could tell from these continuous traits that there was a subset that had what you thought looked like a dominantly inherited, highly penetrant trait.
Right.
And those were the ones that Joe chose to focus on
later on,
doing the molecular biology later on, right, with Mike Brown.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So it was a matter of thinking first about the clinical problem, then defining it epidemiologically, doing the biochemistry and physiology, and then applying some statistical modeling, and out comes the genetics.
Right.
Not so shabby. Not so shabby. You told me also that the Second International Congress of Human Genetics, I'm now going back again because the work of Joe, of course, was in the 70s, and I'm now going back to 1960, but that the Second International Congress of Human Genetics, which was in Rome, and the auxiliary meeting that was in Israel on genetics of Jewish populations were particularly interesting. What were the high points of those?
Well, the high point to me was I knew there was going to be this international congress in Rome, and having been in Amsterdam, in Copenhagen before, certainly I was going to go to Rome, and Stan also went to Rome, and Herschel Roman, he became a human geneticist.
He did. You took Herschel along. Good for you guys.
He went to Rome, oh, I'm sorry, what?
I was asking about both the fine points of the meeting in Rome and the Israel meeting thereafter.
Yes. So because there was a meeting, and I'd gotten interested into populations and Jewish populations and so on, and reading about the history of the Romans and so on, and quite a bit of archaeology had done in order to find out what went on there. I wrote to some of the people in Israel I'd got to meet to know that there is going to be this general meeting in Rome, and why not have a sort of secondary, some meeting relative to Jewish population genetics using archaeologic and genetic markers and things like that. And there was a physician by the name of Sheba who he came to America, and I somehow got to meet him, and he was very interested, and he and some other people then held this meeting in 1960, and there to do this, and they had a good exhibit about all the markers in Jewish people, and they had a marker on what the disease the two of us got in.
Right, 50 years later.
50. Right.
50.
And so with that, now, I got interested in this business to do more studies. They often invited me to Israel now, for various meetings of that sort, and a lot of interesting work got done. We didn't do direct work there.
Right. We've talked a lot about being a mentor, educating fellows, the role of the medical fellow and how one can teach medical fellows genetics, the role of the basic scientist in genetics, and the importance of integrating genetics with medical genetics.
Yes, that was, I felt, and largely because I'd done it, I think it wasn't then therefore that difficult to do it. Other people could do it too. That if you get training in human medical genetics, since there isn't something now like clinical genetics and so on, and should be done more, the training for the postdoc who comes, he should come and learn about some of the things we are talking now and others, and pick that for his work in the laboratory, but at the same time have him go to clinic quite a few times over the years to see the patients, their families, what the problem is, what the psychological problems are, what you can say, what you shouldn't say, and the whole part of genetic medicine, genetic counseling, and things like that. So when we looked for fellows, we got MDs largely, and we then got them to go to these clinics and find problems there that they could work out later on, write a paper on, and get to be known.
So part of your thinking was that physicians even who were not planning to be medical geneticists, should have this experience in genetics.
Well, to see that there are lots of diseases that may have, that do have genetic backgrounds and so on, and that they should know more about it. And that's what we talk about for the future nowadays. We having learned so much, we say, but if you give a doctor, tell him anything about a sequence, he doesn't know what a sequence is or what it can show and things like that. That they had to learn about those things, which are a little easier than today, I think.
Do you think it's easier now or easier then?
It was easier then than now. I mean, the little genetics, it was not so little, but just simple genetics, could be learned faster than all this stuff nowadays.
Although to some extent now it converges on fewer models.
Yes, but but if you do a complete sequence of someone to say what's actionable, what's real, what's not, there's going to be some of our colleagues in basic science usually, they have promised too much. Nowadays that's going down. If you read our chair in NIH, Francis, he used to say, 5 years from now, or 2 years. Now he goes to 10, 15.
He's growing
training.
up a little,
He knows that this is not going to be this soon, that it's going to take much more time.
From your perspective, what do you think will be the first successful applications of genomics to genetic medication?
Well, like the paper we did.
Our little Pintosaria story.
No.
That's a very little
that
story.
was simple because, you start with the simple things first. But, when the Genome Project came, many people of this sort said, just let's do the complete sequence and we'll be able to treat properly, to cure every disease. Well, that was completely naive in retrospect now. And what's the word? There's a special word for annotating the gene. That's what's so hard.
The annotation is right.
Yes.
Even if you know all the base pairs, knowing what they do is another matter entirely.
Right.
Would you tell us a little about your thinking about neurobiology and the science of the brain, and how you see genetics and its tool, genomics, contributing to this in the future?
Well, as I mentioned to you, I was very interested in psychiatry because, I felt, we really don't know nothing about it. It's very soft. There's no science. Now, that still hasn't gotten much better. I mean, it is better.
We won't tell Eric Kandel you said this.
Did you see Eric Kandel was in the New York Times this morning? Yeah.
He thinks it's gotten better. Yeah.
Yes. No, and he talked about some of the things in the New York Times.
So you were saying, so you think that genomics can bring some?
Well, yes, it'll help together with the other things. But I feel there's so little we know about the brain and how it really works as compared with some of the other organs. I mean, it's like day and night.
Do you think it can be approached in the same way?
Well, I hope, but it may not. I always have said, and that may be naive, that there may be mechanisms in the brain that are completely different from our current models, and that someone will have to find something of that sort.
How do you mean? How do you mean?
Well, the way let's take the hemoglobins. It's simple, the way we can fully, or an enzyme and so on. We know very simply what's going on. We can know pretty well what may happen 10 years from now and all those. We probably are right with some of the simple system. With the brain, I don't think we are there.
It's more than
I haven't followed. I nowadays, there's lots of written up, and you don't know what's real and what's not, and one really have to spend full time to know what's been happening. I wish I would have more time.
You have some time. What would be your advice to a young person starting out now on a career in genetics?
What kind of genetics?
That's part of the advice.
Well, no. Well, yes. I mean, there's plenty to do in basic genetics and in basic neurogenetics, I think, and all that, like we were just discussing now, and all the other standard things really that have to be done in basic genetics still.
Would you recommend to a young person that they learn both human genetics and, as you said, real genetics, genetics of flies, genetics of yeast, genetics of worms?
No. I think that's probably too much. I think I was talking it for our kind of fellows who later on will take a position in medical school and will be involved with genetic counseling and clinical genetics. They should have both.
Indeed.
While a person who is strictly going to be a basic geneticist, he should know something about human genetics like they learn about different other species, and this is a very exciting and important, the most important species maybe in terms of what can be done. I mean, I often have said, I wish I could go to a hibernation now and wake up 40 years from now, but probably if that would work even, there's things that have been changed so much that I wouldn't be able to deal with it.
One of the other vehicles for your teaching, besides the fellows and the clinical genetics, has been your book, Arno Motulsky.
Yes.
Could you tell us how that began and where it's going?
Well, that's sort of interesting. Friedrich Vogel is a German, and Friedrich Vogel was in the German army. And I met him the first time I went to Europe, I think even in Copenhagen or sometime later. I guess I was invited to Berlin, actually, and he was there. And he started talking to me, and he found that unlike most people who were interested in genetics at the time, his ideas fitted my ideas and so on. And that I saw him at another meeting, and I felt, because he was a German, and the Germans are awful and have done awful things to us, that I shouldn't hold that against him, and so on. So we became friends, sort of. I never could be a real friend because he was a German, I guess. So then we decided that we would write a book, which we first talked about in the 70s, and the first edition of the Vogel-Motulsky book came in. And the idea, what we did is we wanted to stress history, and there was a story about history, how that would ties up to what has happened, and why certain discoveries were made and others were not made, and have a lot of this, not just mere facts, but have a broader kind of way of in the book. And that
it's written in a humanistic style.
Yeah, that was popular, actually, not with many people. For instance, a recent review of the 4th edition said there are 2 chapters they quote, which in fact I had largely written. There's too much general stuff and so on. There's plenty real things to know.
Too much context about what life really is as opposed to base pairs.
So with all that, then we kept up with several editions, but then he died a few years ago. And by the way, this book was written by just the 2 of us, which was a little crazy at the later editions for 2 people to write all of human medical genetics. Now then when he died and so on, I decided together with others to have a modern kind of book, just have a couple editors and then have different authors for different subjects.
Studios Antonarakis was involved in that?
Yes, he was very good. He was one of the editors. And the 4th edition, that's like this new way, has come out about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. Unfortunately, like all textbooks, things are not doing very well because people, they want everything on the web, or they want a thing that way. And even these books are hard. You can't read them in bed.
I think we have talked them out, Arno.
I probably talked too much.
No, you did not talk too much. Thank you very much for telling us your story.